I think we can make a start for it. Okay, afternoon everyone, and on behalf of the SAICE FLP Pretoria branch and CESA YPF Gauteng North branch, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you joining us today for our online webinar titled Unlocking Professional Status for PR Engineer. I am just quickly going to turn on my camera so you guys know who's speaking. Perfect. Can you guys all hear me and see me? The thumbs up would be great. Thanks. Okay. So this webinar has been carefully designed with the candidate engineers in mind to equip you with practical insight, guidance, and mentorship as you navigate what can often feel like a daunting process, which is the ECSA professional registration. And as we all know that becoming a registered professional engineer isn't just a checkbox on a career to-do list, but it's also a milestone, one that represents a high standard of competency, ethics, and responsibility. It's something that can open doors to exciting opportunities, which is why we started the series, and we hope to have more webinars and events in the future. We know that many engineers struggle with the process due to lack of information, support, and mentorship. And that's exactly what we aim to change in today's session as well as in the future. So we are incredibly fortunate to be joined by our panel who will be sharing their knowledge with us. And first we have John Cato, who will guide us through the ECSA PrEng registration process, as well as shedding light on the engineering report. And then afterwards, we will have Shabnam Bahari, who will speak on the common pitfalls and how to avoid rejection. And then later, we will be having a Q&A panel, which will include John, Shabnam, as well as Tumisang Gabriel, who brings valuable experience as well as perspective from an ECSA member. And then Tom, who will be assisting me in facilitating that. So we encourage you all to engage, ask questions, as well as take full advantage of this opportunity. It's not just a webinar, but it's also a knowledge sharing platform. So without wasting any more time, I think we're gonna get right into it. John, would you like to just turn on your camera so that everyone can see who they're talking to? Great. Okay, so John Cato has earned his Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and began his professional journey with Group 5 roads. He then transitioned into consulting engineering positions both domestically and internationally, including Ireland, where he was responsible for designing and supervising a range of infrastructure projects, including water, sewer, stormwater, and road systems. John held the position of Executive for Policy and Standards at ECSA for 5 years before moving on to serve as a resident engineer on bulk pipeline projects. Currently, John is the engineering support manager at SAICE PDP, where he has dedicated the past 4 years to presenting courses and mentoring candidates for professional registration. John, the room is yours. I think you are mute, John.
All right, thank you for that introduction. Can I get a thumbs up for everybody? You can see my screen. Should be the front screen. Okay, we're all good to go. All right, so I've been tasked to shed light on ECSA's process and decoding the engineering report. So as it's been alluded to, it seems a very daunting task, but as we go through this, we will sort of try and break it down to easier steps to make it a lot easier for you. Just to touch base, that's who I am. I've had the introduction, so hopefully I can shed light on the processes as well. So in terms of ECSA's process, the first question is, do you qualify? Do you have the base qualification, which is basically a discipline, and is that qualification accredited by ECSA? And for PrEng, it's always a 4-year qualification that is required as a base qualification for registration. If you have that, you then now need to gain some experience to ensure that you become competent in the 11 outcomes that ECSA have prescribed. It is stated in their policy a minimum of 3 years. However, it normally takes 4 to 5 years. It depends on the candidate themselves and the process that they are prepared to push, because a lot of the time you would end up in one end of a career and you need other experience, and if you don't advise your supervisors accordingly, you get stuck in one particular area and you don't gain the relevant experience, and you sit there for too many months to actually gain the relevant experience in the shortest time available. All right. So at ECSA, there's the engineering category, which is obviously the PrEng, and this is where we define complex work. And we'll get into that word complex, and I think that's the biggest question that everybody is going to have in terms of what is complex work. Obviously, there are various disciplines associated with the engineer. There are the 11 disciplines that are indicated there. As I said, I am a civil engineer, but remember, all the ECSA outcomes are the same for all the different disciplines. All right, so in terms of the process that you need to follow, it seems fairly straightforward. We need to download the application form. I've given you the link there, the name of the document. However, please be careful. You need to make sure that you have the latest revision. ECSA have in the past 2 years changed these revisions every year, and last year they changed the other application form twice in the same year. So just you need to make sure that you have the most recent revision of the documentation before you proceed to completing it. All right. So then obviously simple steps: complete the application form with your details, your qualifications, etc. There's declarations required in the first section of the application form. There's permission of oath signatures required, and I'm just going to do that. So then we start with, it seems counterintuitive. Everybody starts off with their training and experience reports, and this is what I did. However, I would recommend that you start off with your training and experience summary. This is where you break down your whole career from your qualification up to the time that you are submitting, and you break it down according to the requirements in the documents, where there's a change of responsibility or a change of employment. This then defines the number of TERs and TEOs that you may have to write. And in some cases, you don't want to have 15 of these TER periods. It just becomes very cumbersome in completing your report. However, so around 6 to 8 TER periods is very reasonable in terms of being able to document the relevant experience that you need or need to show for your submission. So suggest that you complete your TES, then you go and start writing your TERs for each of those work periods that you have defined before. And if you have greater than 10 years of experience, your earlier periods, so from qualification up to most probably 3 or 4 years back, you can write a TEO. It's just an outline of your experience. It's more of a bulleted point, bit of a summary, as opposed to a TER, which is a little bit more detailed than your TEO. Then we go and complete our engineering report, and this is where we state how we did these things. However, this engineering report, we'll try and break down the details a little bit more later in the presentation. Right, once you've got all this documentation together, you need to ensure that you now create a profile on ECSA. They have an online system, so you can go and click on that link in the document there, and you go create a profile for yourself, complete your details. There's a verification process associated with it as well. So once you've now created your profile, then you need to go and create your application. And there's a couple of documents that now need to be uploaded against that application that you have created. So this is the application form itself, pages 1 to 5. So as I said, that's your details. Then obviously they need your qualifications, certified copies. Please make sure that they are recently certified. Also a certified copy of your ID. Then they would need a proof of payment uploaded, and depending on your status with ECSA, you would need to ensure that the payment is up to date. If you have been a candidate and you've got arrear fees outstanding, you'd have to settle those fees before you actually make a payment for your professional application itself. Then obviously comes your TERs and TEOs as a set of documents in one file, and then your separate TES report gets uploaded. Then finally your engineering report gets uploaded in a separate area. And don't forget your IPD report. If everybody is familiar with IPD, it's initial professional development. So this is relating to various training that you have attended from your qualification through to the date of your submission. And this training does not have to be CPD accredited, but if it is, it's just as good. And over and above this, there is your referee reports that are also required as part of your submission to ECSA. Okay. They do not get uploaded by yourself. That is the referee's responsibility to email it to ECSA, and they have an email address in the application form where they need to email it to, the details of how they email it to ECSA. And then when it gets to ECSA, we then start looking at the administrative process. So this is where admin within ECSA will then look at all the documentation that has been received to ensure that every little piece of information is there. So they've got the TEO, they've got the qualifications, etc., etc. And at this stage, if there's any outstanding information, they will contact you to indicate, listen, I need this piece of information, please submit it within the next week or in the next 2 weeks, depending on the time frames. And once as part of that admin function, they also look for the referee reports. So as I said, this is an external submission to ECSA. So you need to be very close to your referee to ensure that they have submitted timeously that referee report to ECSA, so that your application from your side coming through the portal does not delay in any way. So once it's complete in terms of all the administrative checks, it goes through to an assessment phase, which is what they call the experience appraisal phase, where they look at the written content of your reports. So they look at your TERs and they look at your engineering report. At this stage, they have 3 options in terms of what they find in these documents. If for some reason there's some information that they can't quite get out in terms of competency requirements, it's not indicated for a particular outcome, they will then put that application in what they call abeyance. So this abeyance is not a refusal. It's basically a decision to say, listen, you are still requiring some further experience in outcomes 2, 3, or whatever. They will indicate in a deficiency statement which outcomes are short, and you have a number of months. It's 12 months to rectify that, gain the relevant experience, and resubmit your application. So with the extended period, obviously there might be extra work that you are currently carrying out, so you'll have to complete an additional TER and any updates on the existing documents that may be required based on the deficiency statement. That submission back to ECSA does not attract any additional fees. You can then just resubmit it through your administrator at ECSA, because he'll email you directly and say, listen, you have 12 months. So that process. And then it'll go back through the assessment phase, etc. And again, if there's still something short, it'll go back to abeyance. If now they're looking at these documents and there's nothing in the documents in terms of the written content that they feel confident that you have indicated competency against these 11 outcomes, they will issue a refusal, basically a fail, at the early stages. They won't even send you through to a professional interview, and then you can have an advisory interview with ECSA to ask them in terms of what was short, what didn't I do, etc., etc. So you have an opportunity to inquire about the shortcomings of your reports. And then the favorable outcome of that EA assessment is obviously they recognize that your written report now is able to indicate your competency. They now send you through to a professional interview where you now need to do a presentation to now demonstrate your competency. And obviously there is only two outcomes of that interview. You either make it as a pass and then everybody can celebrate, or unfortunately you fail. And some of the reasons for failure is just nervousness, and the candidates are not able to respond to questions that are asked adequately, because the written content of your reports has been assessed to be adequate. So obviously there's some shortfall in the delivery of your competence across to the reviewers. And again, if you fail there, it's an advisory interview, again, just explaining exactly what shortcomings had come across in the interview. So that's the ECSA process. It's fairly straightforward. There are some nuances along the way, but obviously we are going to start looking at the engineering report, which is now the main crux of your whole submission. And obviously what they are looking for in that engineering report is based on a standard. And there you see RO2 STA, PE, PT, and PN. It's one document with all the standards for the engineers, technologists, and technicians. Obviously, as engineers, you'll only look at the engineering section in that document. And this is where it defines the complexity required for an engineer. The degrees of responsibilities that you need to work through, the level descriptors of what kind of work you should be doing, the various criteria, and your competence requirements. So it's your outcomes that is defined in that document. There is another document, which is your RO8, which is your competency standard guideline document. It now guides the candidates in terms of this particular standard, what they are specifically looking for. These are not the only two documents ECSA have. They do have a whole set of other documents. There's obviously the policy document that now defines the requirements of registration for ECSA. As I said, the main document in terms of defining competency is the standard. Then we have the guide that explains that standard. And then we have these supporting documents. RO3 is the process, which I've sort of briefly explained to you at a high level, so it's not too complicated. There's the actual process document you can go and have a look at. Then we have the T&M, training and mentoring guideline. So that facilitates how the training and mentoring should be done. And then on the right-hand side there, the RO5 documents. These are the discipline-specific documents associated with professional engineering and that particular discipline, whether it be civil, mechanical, chemical, etc., etc. It just defines what kind of activities a particular discipline would need to carry out to achieve the relevant outcomes for the 11 outcomes of ECSA. All right. And as I said in the beginning, when we're talking ECSA, we need to start looking at how these reports are put together. And the biggest question is going to be around the complexity. But these engineering reports, just some simple pointers, it's now to reflect your engineering development and your proficiencies. How did you go from making coffee in the office all the way to now developing your own designs? And there's a whole level of responsibilities associated with that. They also want it to be in conventional prose form, using the first person singular, and that's the biggest crux of these reports. They are not interested in what your team did. We designed this. It's not about we, it's about you. I did this in this particular project. I did that. What did you do? All right. Then also just to look at some practicalities in terms of linking your engineering report to those training experience reports that you have drafted, which is all the different periods that we had identified. So at least when they get to the engineering report and they say, I designed the structural bridge as part of your engineering report, but in your training and experience report, there's no reference to any bridges that you designed there. They need that link back to your training and experience report. All right. In your engineering report, when you're writing it, you need to make reference to the relevant outcomes that ECSA have defined and looking at the complex engineering problem descriptor as well as the complex engineering activity descriptor. I've spoken about the degree of responsibility, A to E. Basically, A is learning at the start of your career, to E when you're now producing designs, etc. There is a word limit on these documents, 6,000 words. So they want you to count the words and insert the number there. They are not explicitly cut off at 6,000 words, and they don't read anything outside of the 6,000 words. So the 6,000 word is just a guideline to ensure that you don't waffle on and have a 10,000 word report that takes them forever to read through. It's trying to force you to be short and concise and to the point to make sure that it's easier for the reviewers to read the report as well. You do have an opportunity to add annexes to the document where you can insert diagrams, tables, your design calculations, and any other illustrations that you feel would add value to the engineering report itself. However, the mechanical guys, they are looking for a 4-page design calculation from beginning to end as part of the annexure. All right. So if you are mechanical, that's just one of the requirements. And you'll see that in the documentation that has been defined. At the end of the report, you now have to indicate exactly in 200 words. It's not many words, but you need to indicate why the information that you have provided indicates your competency or demonstrates your competency as a professional engineer. Right. So moving on We're starting to get into the difficult questions in terms of the complex engineering problems. How are they defined? What is complex problems? And there are some tests that are outlined in the documentation, and we'll just sort of bring it to the front here. In-depth, fundamental, and specialized engineering knowledge, basically from first principles. If you have to define a problem from first principles, then this particular problem is complex. Are they ill-posed? Are they underspecified or overspecified? So those are the aspects of complexity. Are there high-level problems? Are there components and sub-problems associated with this particular problem that you're talking to? It's not just one element. And is it unfamiliar? Have you ever come across this before? Or is it a common issue? Then obviously it's not a complex problem. So as I said, these are some tests that you can carry out to ensure that the problem of your project is now at the right complexity level. Is a problem an engineering problem? Firstly, does it require fundamental and specialized engineering knowledge? For example, I'm a civil engineer. If we have a culvert and it's blocked by debris, is that an engineering problem? It may end up being an engineering problem if the capacity of the culvert is not adequately sized, but if it's just because there's debris in front of the culvert, that's not an engineering problem. You don't need any specialist knowledge. You just remove the debris and everything is solved. So that's not an engineering problem. So that's just an example. The nature of the problem in order to establish complexity, I spoke about this: ill-posed, high-level, and unfamiliar, and infrequently encountered issues. Does it happen often? If it happens often, it's most probably more broadly defined and well-defined as opposed to complex. What is encountered in the solution process? Solutions are not obvious. So your solution to the problem, it's not something that is easily available, or it's not obvious, and it needs some original thinking based on some first principle fundamentals that you're looking at. Is it outside of the scope of the standard? So in terms of maybe a structure, our current codes of conduct, not codes of conduct, codes of practice, in terms of the loading, it doesn't have that in that specification. So you have to go elsewhere. Maybe an international code is used. You know, that then starts looking at the complexity of that particular solution as well. Does it require any information from a variety of sources? So it's not just, oh, I'm just getting information from one particular area. I need to get information from multiple areas to ensure that I can get the correct solution. Wide-ranging or conflicting issues, technical engineering, and interested or affected parties. So it's looking at the broader context. It's not only looking at the one aspect of a particular problem or the solution. Being a civil engineer, looking at a pipeline, a manhole to manhole, that is not, it's well defined. So you're designing a sewer between two manholes, or if you're now increasing the complexity, you then start looking at the network, then it becomes a bit more broadly defined, and then it's the network and the outfall sewer and a rising main. Now there is a requirement for complexity for all those different aspects. The other test, what is involved in decision making? So the biggest thing here, judgment and decision making, uncertain context. What are your assumptions? Did you make any assumptions in terms of the contributing aspects to the problem, or was it just standard taken out of a document and I used those particular aspects to make the decision. So all these various assumptions then starts creating the relevant complexity that we need. Have significant consequences in a range of contexts. So this is obviously where the impact of your decision impacts not only just one aspect, it is a broader context of that. All right. The activity, complex activities, fairly similar in terms of that. The engineering problem, unfamiliar, diverse, significant resources, people, money, equipment, material. If there's multiple aspects associated with that particular activity, then you can define it as complex. The experience, constraints, time, finance, infrastructure, laws, and standard codes. We mentioned all of this. It's similar to those of the engineering problem. Significant risks in a range of contexts. So it's not just looking at the local impact of your particular activity. All right. So here we are looking at the degree of responsibility. And this is where ECSA like to see a progression, being exposed, assisting, participating, contributing, and performing. Nowadays, most people do not start at being exposed where there's an induction. You're not very long in degree of responsibility A. You generally would start in an organization at B or C, where you start doing engineering activities as soon as you start, but it's under supervision, and the supervision gets less and less until you're performing, where we start looking at works in a team without supervision and recommends work outputs. All right, so that's just the degree of responsibility. So just some examples in terms of complexity, multiple leveled interchange in terms of roads, definitely defined as complex. We're not designing a straight road in a housing estate, for instance. Electricity, as I say, I'm electrical, but from experience of engaging with other electrical, this is something that would be defined as a complex engineering aspect to electrical engineers, as well as tariff designs. They're not straightforward. So we can then define those aspects as complex. Sewer treatment works, obviously there's multiple disciplines associated with the treatment works, from chemical, mechanical, civil, as well as. Right. So now, just to give a little bit of detail in terms of your training and experience report, is now telling ECSA what you did over your years of experience, from your qualification up to your submission. What did you do? I designed a road, I designed an electrical, is what you did. I designed this, I designed that, I managed this, I presented here, etc., etc. So those reports define what you did. However, the engineering report is a little bit more detailed, and it now needs to tell ECSA how and why you did these things. All right? In terms of how did you go about that design? What process did you follow? What steps did you take? And why did you choose this particular solution and that? Your decision-making associated with that particular thing. All right. Understand that your ER is not a repeat of your TER. Again, it's where you explain how you did it and not what you did. You need to ensure that you're at the right level of responsibility in terms of your ER. So your TERs will vary in terms of the degree of responsibility from point A all the way through to E. But when we're at the engineering report, we need to be writing where we are at least D, but preferably at degree of responsibility E. And this is where we need to provide the evidence to show competency in all the 11 outcomes of ECSA. So you need to show your engineering knowledge within each of those outcomes. All right. As I said, you would include your design calculations, sketches, and your financial comparisons. How did you make those decisions? And how did you do those calculations? Can't emphasize your own contributions and inputs, right? Some of my candidates, they talk about, I was in a site meeting. So what was your role in the site meeting? I chaired the meeting, I managed the meeting, or was I just sitting in on the meeting, etc. So understanding the legislation within your work environment, how you used it, and how you complied with it in your particular, whether it's a design or your implementation side of the project. Reference to standard documents and standards. What specifications were you using? What standards did you design to, etc.? So that's what needs to go in. First person, we've chatted about that. It needs to be your role in that particular project. Can't emphasize this in terms of an organized fashion in terms of how this report needs to look. It can't be, oh, I'm talking about this aspect, then I'm talking about that aspect. It has to be a nicely organized document detailing out the steps, and we'll get to that. Obviously, it comes with standard, proper grammar and punctuation, etc., must be part of your report. As I said, we want to know how you performed the task, how you evaluated your decisions, etc., etc. Please try and not use any sort of jargon and padding your report just because you're trying to get to the quota of the 6,000 words. We do recommend that you use engineering language, the verbs. So I was on site monitoring. I was the engineer on site. So you've got to use the engineering verbs associated with that particular activity that you're involved with. All right. Don't leave things half-baked, as if I want to put it that way. It needs to start and end and complete the process. You need to describe your thought process. What they want to see is, what did you do at the beginning in terms of defining the problem? How was the problem defined? Then what did you do? The next step, and a step-by-step process description of how you actually got to the final solution, including your analysis of the solutions that you put on the table, multiple solutions, alternatives, etc. How did you get to that final decision? All right. Get the order right. We can't have a solution without having investigations done. So you got to make sure that the order of your document is in the right order in terms of the process that you followed. All right. So what I like to suggest is, for engineers, as much as we have a engineering report to write, there's nothing that is going to guide you in terms of what to write about, other than the main outcome of ECSA, which is the 11 outcomes. The technologist engineering report have created these, what they call sub-criteria for each outcome. And you can structure your report provided, and I would recommend that you address all these sub-headings. So you don't have to indicate sub-criteria 1.1 because it's not a requirement for an engineering report. But it is a requirement in terms of, have you written about defining engineering problems? Have you written how you investigated those problems? Have you written how you analyzed those problems, etc., etc.? So this is just a guide in terms of pointers on what to write in your engineering report. You don't have to write it in the block like the technologist, but you need to at least address these different aspects as you go through your engineering report. So these are the ones for outcome 1. So there's 3 sub-criteria that you need to cover. For outcome 2, this is your solution, how you designed or developed the solution, your alternative solutions, and detailed specification and documentation. Have you done a detailed specification? Have you done design documentation, etc., etc.? So as long as you cover those different aspects, you are on the right road. So for outcome 3, what principles did you use? Obviously, this is at BTech level. So obviously, you now need to indicate at your engineering level what principles, practices, and technologies you have applied in this particular solution that you developed, or etc. Working knowledge of areas of practice that interact with yours. Teamwork. How did you do teamwork? Do you understand what an electrical engineer needs to do for the civil engineer on, say, the treatment works, cable sizing? Do you understand the chemical process that the chemical engineer has to do to define the requirements of your treatment works? Do you know those basics? And even within your own discipline, you may have other areas of practice that you are not competent in. For instance, I'm not a structural engineer, but I do know the requirements of loading. I do know the requirements of bending schedules and bending moments and shear forces and things like that, that the structural engineer needs to address to ensure that the design is correct. That's my working knowledge. I don't do that work, but that particular individual will do it. You need to indicate those aspects of your outcome 3, which is your understanding of principles. Indicate finance, statutory, and safety and management knowledge in terms of what you know is applicable in your practice area. Then outcome 4, managing yourself, people, and work priorities and processes. So these are the things that you need to write about in your engineering report. State your role. What did you do in planning, organizing, and leading activities? Knowledge and conditions of operation of contracts. What kind of contractual elements do you use? What are you familiar with? Which documents do you use? GCC, NEC, FIDIC, whichever it is, and how do you maintain professional business relationships? All right. So that's outcome 4. Outcomes 5, writing clearly. This is communication. Can you issue clear instructions? Where have you issued clear instructions? It's site instructions, etc. What reports have you done? Are they approved, clear, and concise? Have you presented orally? Is what is asked of a technologist, and it's something that ECSA want to see how you can present at the different levels, from peer presentations to senior management presentations, and also down to community and other levels, so that you can communicate on all different levels with the appropriate audience that you are now delivering to. You're not going to tell the community about the safety of factor, or those aspects are not going to be communicated to the community, nor are the details of your design going to be communicated to management. They just need to know costs and time, etc. So it's just understanding those aspects. Outcome 6 is social impacts, cultural and environmental and technical. All right. Have you identified affected parties of your engineering activities? Where have you identified it and mitigated them as also part of outcome 6, identifying and mitigating that particular risk. 7, this is the legal and regulatory aspects of your project. What aspects have you complied with in terms of legal, regulatory, and that? Where have you applied them? Various legislations, depending on the environment that you're working in. Which ones have you used and which ones did you have to comply with? Other aspects of 7 is also talking to safe and sustainable materials, components, and systems, and also looking at your risk and your risk management elements of a project. Okay. Number 8, which is your ethics. Are you conversant and operate in compliance with ECSA rules? Rules of conduct, the code of conduct. Do you know the code of conduct? Do you know the different aspects of the code of conduct? There's administrative, there's professional, etc., etc. Which ones of those have you applied in your recent or in your career from qualification? Number 8.2 is a difficult one. Where have you identified an ethical problem and how did you resolve it? So how you couch that in your engineering report is you need to identify where it happened and what you implemented. Remember, it's not what your supervisor or your senior engineer or your contracts director indicated to do. It's, I suggested that this is how we resolve this particular ethical problem. Remember, it's all about you. Okay. Number 9, we're talking about judgment. Where have you exercised judgment and how did you get to that particular conclusion in terms of why you chose a particular aspect, right? Or a solution or an alternative. Which factors did you take into consideration? Did you look at finance? Did you look at pressures or velocities or whatever, and the impacts of that particular solution on the greater community? Remember the complexity. Did we look narrowly or did we look at the broader context of this particular problem and where the affected parties are and how we mitigated those? Looking at outcome 10, social environment, sustainable development, right? So this is now looking at what did you make responsible decisions for in terms of the social aspects of the project. Being responsible is also seeking advice from some responsible authority, maybe somebody with a different discipline that you needed input on your particular solution. So we talk about mechanical and civil in terms of pumps and electrical cable sizing, pump sizing efficiencies. So there's a whole lot of interaction that happens between these different disciplines that you need to say, listen, I had to ask the electrical guy what the cable size was, etc., etc. All right. And your academic knowledge in using that you use to formulate your decisions. So there might have been a particular calculation that you had to carry out that assisted you in making that particular decision. All right. And then moving on, we look at outcome 11, which is the final one, where we're talking about IPD, your professional development, where you need to now look at your strategy and your philosophy. So your philosophy is the high level. This is why I need to do IPD. And your strategy is, how did you do it? I attended various courses on a regular basis, or I developed an IPD plan with my organization that ensured that I attended 1 course a year or 2 courses a year, whatever it is. All right. So that's just sort of a guide that you can use using the engineer's technologist engineering reports sub-criteria. And as I say, don't put it in boxes like this, because you as the engineer, you have a bit of latitude. You've got more than one project that you can use. So you can bring in the different projects as long as they have relevant context for that particular outcome. You could also group your report into the various groups that ECSA have identified outcomes as group A, B, C, D, and E, talking to the different elements of all 11 outcomes. All right, so that's just a structure of how you could put your report together, but it just depends on how best you feel is going to work for you on the types of project that you are working on. And then just at a high level, these are all the 11 outcomes of ECSA, with the core ones being your problem solving and the solution synthesis and the core. And then you have all the surrounding ones in terms of the engineering knowledge that we used for that. How did we comply with the legal aspects? How did we manage the implementation of the project, ethics of the whole aspect, as well as what judgments did you come to, which is 9 and 10, and then looking at the risks associated with it, which is 6. And then don't forget, we've got the IPD, which is the whole learning aspect around us as engineers, that we need to make sure that we do not neglect since qualification. We need to make sure that we continue from qualification, attend various courses. As you know, things change along the road. All right, so that's me. Thank you for listening, and obviously we will take a Q&A session a little bit later. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to hand back to Lee.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, and thank you for that presentation. It was extremely interesting and I think quite beneficial. If you guys do have any questions, then please do wait for the Q&A or put them in the Q&A and we will address them after our next presentation. So Shubnam, I'm going to ask you to please share your or put your camera on, just so that everyone can see who you are. So Shabnam Bahari is a professionally registered electrical engineer with more than 20 years of experience in the utility sector. She worked at the front lines of distribution engineering and technology implementation at Eskom, and now leads her own company, Resolute Engineering Services, focusing on consulting and professional development. Shabnam is widely recognized for guiding engineers through the ECSA professional registration process, offering coaching, application support, and mentorship grounded in technical depth and professional standards. With over a decade of experience mentoring candidates, she believes professional development is not only key to unlocking individual career growth, but also critical to delivering broader public and economic value. Shabnam, thank you.
Thanks, Raylene. Appreciate that introduction. Raylene, just to confirm, can you hear me clearly?
All well.
Okay. Perfect. And my slides are up in full screen?
Yes.
It's awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and looking through the attendee list, also seeing some familiar names. So really excited to share this presentation with all the new names and the ones that I'm familiar with. I think it's really incredible to see the number of people actually on this call today. It's a staggering number, just showing how interested we are as engineers in our professional development. And I just want to thank our organizers and our hosts for actually bringing us together today to have this discussion and learn from each other. John has shared some incredibly valuable information. I think if you take what he's shared and actually bring it into your day-to-day and actually apply it as you work towards your registration, you're going to have no problem at achieving professional registration. But really now it's my task to make sure you actually don't have those problems, because unbeknownst to you, you might come across some pitfalls that could actually derail you or delay you and cause you some trouble with your application process. So what I've done is, over the few years that I've been a mentor and a coach to applicants, and now especially that I talk to a lot of applicants on LinkedIn about challenges that they're having, I've been able to collect information about processes and aspects of development and the application process that really catches them out and causes them either a long delay or causes refusal or abeyance. And what I'm going to share in my presentation today is lessons from those other engineers. And in the hopes of sharing that, we hope that you don't face those same challenges or you see them coming. So you learn from the experiences of others and you can move forward into your journey quite effectively and efficiently. And as John also explained, it can be quite a long journey and we don't want to waste any time. We want to really be efficient and effective in how we achieve registration. We want to apply the standards, but sometimes it's really good to anticipate challenges and work those challenges out of our path. So when you think about achieving success, it's always good to think about the end goal. And the end goal for us is showing ECSA that we have the competence to achieve the outcomes at a high responsibility level and to also do that in complex engineering work, as John has explained. So as engineers, very important to combine all of those things, competence to achieve the outcomes, high responsibility in complex engineering work. But that's a very, very big end goal. So to help us think about it, I've broken it down into 4 sub goals to help us navigate a bit easier through our path to registration. And again, because there's so many of us on this call, I'm not quite sure where you might be in your journey. So I've mapped out the entire journey, starting from graduating and securing engineering work, followed by becoming eligible and ready to apply for registration, then submitting a compliant application, and finally, our goal of preparing for and succeeding in an interview. So I'm going to take us through those goals, and I've put together a sketch to give you a bit of a visual representation of that journey. And our goal is to make it through the pathway all the way to a positive final outcome. But you'll see on the sketch, I've also put warning signs to indicate there are challenges along the way that you really need to be aware of. And as you look at the sketch, also try to figure out where you might be in your journey so that you can relate to the information that I'm going to share and kind of connect with it a bit better. So my discussion is around the pitfalls, right? So pitfalls are things that can slow you down or result in rejection. And my goal isn't to scare you. Everything we do in life has challenges, just the same as the professional registration process. But what we want to do is help you see them and avoid them. We want to prevent the delays and we want to give you tools and techniques to try and address some of them, but also the confidence that you might need to recover or avoid them. As John explained, the most significant aspects related to the consequences of failing to provide a good, sorry, I'm just adjusting my screen there, of failing to provide a good submission to ECSA is going to be abeyance or refusal. So before you get to the submission, everything you're doing in your journey towards your application is in your control. You have the latitude to fix things and adjust things, but it's really out of your control once you make the submission to ECSA. So most significantly, what we're trying to avoid is things especially going wrong in your application process. One of the things would be abeyance, as John explained, that abeyance is a result of some gaps in your application and ECSA puts it on hold for a period of about 12 months. And the cost of that is a delay. You're losing time towards your application and towards your registration. The worst case scenario is if you have significant gaps that cannot be resolved and the reviewers deem that your submission is completely non-compliant or to whatever extent that might be, and they reject your application at the submission stage when they've reviewed the documentation or after your interview. And rejection means that you are no longer in the process. You've now lost all that time. You've also lost the money that you spent making that application. And you have to now put in more time and more effort to resolve those problems to eventually achieve your registration. So that's the huge consequences we are trying to avoid by learning about these pitfalls. So just some frameworking as I proceed. Remember that I'm talking, when I mention work experience, that I'm talking about engineering work exclusively, and I'm talking about engineering work in your discipline. Also, you might have noticed my sketch was very linear, and I understand that careers take many different routes. So just apply your own experience to the lessons, but for now, it's generalized enough that you can understand it and apply it. And then just to define a pitfall is a hidden or unexpected danger, mistake, or problem that can cause failure or delay if not identified and managed early. And to help you to relate to that to some extent, I've categorized some of these pitfalls into 4 categories. Firstly, traps, things that grab you and hold on to and are very hard to overcome, and you need a lot of tools and techniques to overcome those traps. Stumbling blocks, sometimes minor things that cause a misstep and easy to recover but could cause a slight delay. Hurdles, things that are actually hard to get over, real challenges, and you have to put in a lot of effort to get over that hurdle. And blind spots, usually due to being kind of unaware of certain things or certain rules, and you're not aware that those rules are affecting you and you don't realize it, and it's causing you delays. So you have to overcome those blind spots to move forward. Okay, and then just coming back to the sketch, so I'm going to get us started off right here at the very beginning where we all started with our degree. And the very first thing is a trap. We get our degree and we're really excited that we know so much as engineers. And the trap of that degree is thinking we know so much and therefore it should be easy to get our professional registration. And all we need is what we know. And then a knock on is, especially those of us that have gone and done postgraduate studies, is thinking that our MSCs and PhDs should automatically qualify us for professional registration. And that's a really serious misconception. And I do see it quite a bit. And you have to actually understand that the knowledge we gained through our studies is great and we have to apply it, but professional registration is about how we do when we apply it in the real world. We have to be effective when we apply our knowledge, and that is what professional registration is testing our ability to solve problems, perform activities, take responsibility, and work ethically in the real world. So just education and knowledge alone is not enough to get the registration. And if you proceed into your career with that misconception, you are going to create some gaps in your professional registration applications if you're unaware of the holistic requirements of development. And that will most likely result in abeyance or refusal. And then just an extra note on postgraduate projects. Oftentimes, masters and doctoral projects are extremely complex and very impressive. And what it does is confuses applicants into thinking that because that work is so impressive, it should be good enough to get professional registration. Whereas if you haven't really structured that research into alignment with the outcomes, as John had shared the outcomes earlier, it is going to result in gaps in your engineering report and most likely result in rejection. So before you think that your postgraduate studies could work for you, you have to test it and make sure that you don't have any gaps. Now, we've moved away from getting employment and we're now working as an engineer and we're trying to get to ourselves to a point where we are PR ready. And I've heard from a lot of young graduates that one of the hurdles they face immediately is that they find themselves in an organization that doesn't have an engineering training culture or they don't have registered mentors, which means that they realize very quickly they're facing challenges with actually developing towards their professional competencies. And another challenge is because they're stuck in that place, they don't realize that they are waiting passively for a mentor to solve this problem, whereas they could actively seek one out. Now, in combination, this scenario is so daunting to young graduates and could be daunting to anybody in any point in their career that they don't realize they have a blind spot in that they can actually self-guide. And I think that's something I really want to emphasize is that you should rely on yourself first. Educate yourself first, learn about ECSA's documents and how they can help you, and you lead the way for your own development. So ECSA has a lot of documents that can guide you. Their road to registration recordings on YouTube, and your volunteer association like SAICE has a lot of workshops and training. So before you give in to the situation of having a workspace that doesn't support you, find things that empower you to help you move forward yourself. Then another challenge is actually having access to mentors and resources, but not using them effectively. And I experienced this quite a bit as well, where candidates think the mentor is meant to drive their development, but it's actually the other way around. You're meant to drive your development. You're in charge. You push forward. The mentor is meant to give direction and help with alignment and help with checks and gap assessments, but you are meant to actually drive. So you need to actually be in charge of that relationship. And finally, something that's common at the moment, having mentors who have not kept up to date with the standards and processes. Over the years, ECSA has changed a lot of the standards, especially the competency standard. They've changed their process for application. And mentors that achieved registration many years ago might not have understood these changes and might provide incorrect direction. So again, it comes down to you self-empowering and finding out what you need so that even if your mentor is really good but misinformed, you can correct the situation. Next, a stumbling block, especially when you get into work and you're really enjoying your work and you want to do really well, is that you think that doing your job is good enough. And you go ahead and just spend years working without actually having an effective training and development plan. And that's a really big stumbling block because you might not actually be doing the work that validates your competence when you apply for registration. Another stumbling block is when you have a training and development plan, which most of us have with our employers, it's not aligned to the expectations for ECSA. So you're not aligning it to achieve the outcomes. You're not aligning it to achieve the responsibility levels. So very importantly, you can refer to the RO4 document, the training guide, and the discipline-specific training guides to help you align any training development plan that you have to achieve the expectations for registration. Or if you don't have a plan, there's a lot of information in there for you to develop your plan. The next hurdle, and quite significantly, and which is very important that you paid attention to what John spoke about, is complex engineering work. Many firms don't actually stretch to complex engineering work, and you might find that you're not getting the type of work that aligns to that requirement, which is when you have to start looking for it and seeking it out. Else, if you don't get that work done, you're not going to be able to put together a successful application. Next, a blind spot is not reviewing and checking your work to make sure that you're gaining the experience and resolving any gaps. And finally, you don't have actual training and education on your development plan, which is a major gap because it's part of your development and the professional application to show that you have been furthering your knowledge through valid training over the years. So all of these challenges, if you're aware of them, it's going to delay your professional registration. And if you're not aware of them and you make an application anyway, you're going to probably face refusal. So keep that in mind and be sure that you are actually checking against the competency requirements. Strategically, your goals are to self-navigate, as I mentioned, take charge, create your own roadmap, seek out external mentorship if you need mentorship. There's access to mentors, maybe through clients that your company works with, or fellow colleagues or past classmates that have got their registration. Your volunteer association might have access to mentors. And I think ECSA has also been working on an external mentor database. So seek out external mentors if you need. And obviously then take advantage of the available online resources like this webinar and other courses that are available. Make sure you have that development plan in place. Make sure you're tracking yourself against it and keep detailed records of everything you're doing so that you can actually consolidate it to a successful application at the end. So we've gone through our development and we're going to get to this point where we think we are PR ready. And I say think because sometimes we're not aware that there are actually eligibility requirements. So the requirement is for engineers to have worked in an engineering workspace for a minimum of 3 years. So minimum of 3 years, and it can be longer. And at least 12 months of your work experience must be at the highest degree of responsibility level, level E, which is equivalent to a professional. Another blind spot is when you think you're professionally ready, but you actually haven't checked, you haven't tested, you haven't done gap assessments to see if you really are ready. And then another blind spot is you just get started on the application, you have no idea what the process is, you have no idea what's expected, and that could really result in major issues. So regarding the timing, if you submit too early before you're actually meeting the time requirements, The application will be held in abeyance until you complete the time requirements. That's as per ECSA's process. Or if you submit and you weren't actually ready or had no idea what the process entailed, you're likely going to create a lot of gaps in your submission. And again, that's on the path to refusal. There, we are assuming you're PR ready and you are creating your application now, and your goal is to get that application into ECSA. One of the stumbling blocks is that you use outdated templates, as John had mentioned. Make sure that the one you downloaded on your laptop and kept there for years and years is updated to the latest one. Go to ECSA's website, download the latest one, use the latest one. That's because templates get updated, there are rules that are updated, and you might end up missing important parts of the application. Another stumbling block is actually genuinely missing out parts of the application, where you send in your documents to ECSA, but you've missed out TERs, cases where people have actually not even included the engineering report, the IPD is missing, and those are mandatory parts of the submission. And that will affect your submission. If you don't respond to the missing information quick enough, you could be held in abeyance for a period of time. Then the next hurdle comes in now with the good news that we're not in submission cycles anymore. It's continuous application cycles. And the one thing that is maybe a challenge is with the submission cycles, that hard deadline was very motivating. People used to work on their applications daily to get it in. Now, without a deadline, it's left to you to set your own milestones and get it done. And in my experience, you start off highly motivated, and then your motivation wanes, work gets in the way, life gets in the way, and what should have only taken 3 months to prepare a complete application takes 12 months. So that's a major hurdle that you have to be aware of. Set milestones, set goals, and try to achieve them. Don't extend your application development phase. And then finally, a hurdle related to your referees and supervisors. Engage them upfront as you are deciding to move into this application process. Let them know, bring them along on the journey. Don't just drop an email to them at the end and ask them for their reports and signatures. Let them be a part of it and let them help you get the best application possible. And quite frankly, the referees themselves really should be very involved in your development. So making sure that they're part of this process is really important. Now we're going to talk about the engineering reports, and I might reiterate stuff that's already been said, but this is really where things can go horribly wrong. Firstly, when you set up your engineering report, a lot of times you're not writing with enough depth. The content itself is too high level to actually prove the competencies required, and therefore could result in refusal. The other aspect is actually not demonstrating that the project you worked on was complex. So that's a really a significant issue that keeps coming up. And then, as John mentioned as well, the structure and alignment to the outcomes. The report is not a free-form narrative story of work that you did. It has to be structured against the outcomes so that you can prove that you achieved those outcomes. So the content is fully focused on that. The other thing is that as if you start jamming a lot of projects into a report, everything pushes to a high level, and that affects both the structure and the depth of your report. Next, as John mentioned, it's very important about your role. What did you do in your projects? And sometimes you don't talk about your role enough, and you also misalign what you did. So it's very important that you talk about your role in the project, well aligned to the expected degree of responsibility and the judgment expected in complex projects. And finally, within your discipline, make sure that you're discussing work that relates to your discipline or subdiscipline. Sometimes you find yourself in a workplace that doesn't do work strictly in your discipline, and you might find yourself presenting work that's not related to civil or electrical as you are disciplined. Don't present that work. It's going to disqualify you for registration. And definitely don't present non-engineering work because the competencies are all engineering based. So the challenges there is obviously abeyance and refusal. And again, that could happen immediately as your application goes in, or possibly fall apart when you get through to the interview. So let's assume we get through the submission phase and our EAs, the desktop reviews went really well, and we hope that we're going to get into the interview. The blind spot here is assuming that the interviews are very informal and you delay your preparations because you think it's going to be easy. You don't prepare your slides in advance. You don't work on Q&A practice. You forget entirely to review your material and your reports, and you have actually completely forgotten the work you presented. And that's really a trap, because what happens is when you get that interview booking from ECSA, it doesn't allow you a lot of time to really invest in putting together an excellent presentation and be prepared. Usually, at most you're getting 10 to 15 days notice, sometimes even shorter. And with work and life, that's not enough time to really invest in an excellent presentation and preparation. So remember, it's not an informal process, it's not casual. It's very serious. It's a professional interview. You want to go prepared. You want to be able to present your slides in the 15 minutes and answer very deep questions that come. So you want to be able to have well practiced slides, sort out your timing, make sure everything is clear, read your ECSA reports, read your reference materials, the standards, the regulations, and everything else you referenced, and make sure you can articulate responses to deep questions very easily. Another challenge with the interviews is technical setup. You need to have these interviews take place over MS Teams. So you need to have a good computer. You need to have a strong network connection. You need to have a webcam that will stay on through the entire interview. Speakers and mics, obviously, because you need the audio and you need access to the team platform. And if you actually have technical troubles on the day, it's going to totally throw you off. So make sure that you're preparing for this in advance. The other thing is to make sure that you're in a quiet environment, something private where people can't disturb you. There's no noise around you. You can't have anybody in the room with you. So make sure you've arranged an environment that will lead you to success in the interview. And please read the details of the interview very carefully. ECSA gives you good instructions and a guide. And sometimes when you don't read it carefully, you actually create problems for your own interview. So ultimately, the pitfalls, the stumbling blocks at the interview stage is going over your 15 minutes because you failed to practice. And what will happen is you do get cut off, and that is quite jarring and could affect the outcome of your interview. Or the other stumbling block is not reviewing your work well enough to be prepared for those deep dive questions that the reviewers are going to ask. And they'll ask questions about your role and the decisions you made, the complexity of your work, your competence. They'll ask technical questions around the engineering. They'll ask ethical questions and judgment questions and decision making. It covers everything across all the outcomes. And if you're not prepared, you will definitely struggle with the questions. If you do really well, obviously, that's great. We're going to get our PrEngs. And if we struggle at that point in the interview to demonstrate competence against even a single one outcome, we are going to face rejection. So that will be a result of refusal. And that is why you don't want to delay any preparations that you can do for the interview. I've collected just a series of examples of some of the feedback that candidates get related to what causes the challenges along the way. Starting at the top, again, the complex query. If your project is not complex or can't be proven to be complex, especially at the interview, that's immediately a refusal. And sometimes candidates present projects that are predefined, meaning that the actual problem or the cause of the problem is known and the expected solution is known, and all they do is then effect this what is known, and that's not acceptable at an engineer level. So commonly we're getting comments that the projects are not complex or they are predefined. Then when you get into your problem solving phase, candidates are unable to define the problem. They're unable to explain how they investigated and analyzed the problem to understand it. They're unable to articulate how they developed the solutions and the alternatives, or how they applied the relevant advanced knowledge or specialist knowledge or first principles to actually work on the solutions for the problem. Then when you get into the management activities, we see that candidates aren't explaining their role in the management activities or their contributions to it. They're unable to explain how they recognized impacts and addressed it. They struggle with explaining the legal and regulatory requirements that were relevant to their work and how they ensured they were complied with. And they're also unable to articulate how they considered health and safety. When it comes to outcome 8, the code of conduct, it's very important that you live with that code of conduct through your work, apply it in your work, and that way you actually are going to be familiar, because candidates are sometimes unable to articulate the codes and explain how it related to the work that they did. And finally, judgment and decision making. Candidates are unable to articulate their thoughts around how they applied sound judgment and how they applied sound judgment, especially in decision making, and that ultimately causes an indication that they are not competent in those particular outcomes. So with that, I am at the last 2 slides of my presentation, and I think the important message here is that you have to plan for success, but prepare for the pitfalls. Know the rules as presented by John earlier, but also know what can go wrong along the way. And if you do face those setbacks, know that there are methods and techniques and things you can do to get yourself out of those situations. But make sure when you finally make that application, it is sound. Professional registration is earned through readiness, and it is not luck. You might think someone got lucky with their PrEng, but you don't realize the work that they did silently in the background to actually achieve it. So start early, stay intentional, and own your journey. And in order for you to actually drive your development and own that journey, you need to reference all of the material that's available. And I've highlighted some critical documents here from ECSA that can be found on their website, but also use resources like ECSA's YouTube channel, where there are road to registrations, and they often do live workshops, and also your volunteer association, like SAICE or SAICE offers workshops and trainings. So please take advantage of all of those. And I wish you luck in your journey to professional registration. Raylene, handing back to you.
Thanks, Shubnam. All right. Yeah, thank you for that presentation. I think it wasn't a scary presentation, but there were a few shocks here and there. So I think we can go to the Q&A. There has been a lot of engagement in there already. I will just address this one question in the Q&A box, which is by Thea Smith. In the engineering report, how in-depth should the various projects be? Name and location of the project, people involved, or just the basis of the project and my involvement? I'm not sure who of our 3 panelists would want to take that question. John or...
So we're all being very polite here. You take this one. So in terms of this particular question, the name and location of the project, or just the basis of the project and my involvement. So we don't want to go into too much detail, but we need the context in which the project is implemented. So that detail needs to give the context in terms of size, maybe in terms of pipelines, size, etc., etc. So just in that description of the project, we can basically sort of determine complexity in that particular description. And then obviously you'll go into the details of your involvement on that project. So they need to know what that project was about. You don't have to go into huge amounts of details, but it just needs to give the context in which that project is being implemented in. I hope that answers.
Perfect. I'm not sure, Tom, have you seen, I can see a lot of the questions have been answered. If there's any questions that haven't, then I think we can just talk about them now.
Raylene, there was one question which I will avoid answering, but Shubnam and John are welcome to. It's specifically related to rail engineering. John gave some good examples of, you know, 4-level interchange in the road sector, or a extraction of energy from a landfill site and whatever. The question relates to railway engineering. John, what 3 examples can you give of what would constitute a complex engineering problem in the rail sector?
Yeah, the rail sector.
And I know you're not a rail engineer, so you can hide behind the code of conduct and say it's not in your area of competence. But
yeah, absolutely. So look, I can get some details. We have got some in terms of our experience with our mentoring over the many years. We have mentored some rail guys. I haven't personally, and they haven't been recent in our organization, but I can get some details in terms of typical engineering projects that rail engineers would need to be conducting to achieve that complexity that you're requiring. So just send me your details and I can just sort of get into contact with you more specifically or share it with the greater context of the group as well.
Really, if I could also come in there, I also have no background, so I can't give a specific example. But I'm going to lean into what I said earlier that, look, we aren't going to be able to answer every single question just as well because we don't have experience across all disciplines. But ECSA has given guidelines to help candidates check if their projects or the work they've done is complex. And John actually went through all of those questions in his presentation. So I would suggest as well, anybody unsure if the work is complex, go to the RO2 STA standard, scroll all the way down to section 7, the professional engineer section. There's a table in that section that asks you questions. Answer those questions as diligently and honestly as you can. And if you come out with a combination of positive responses to those questions, you can be assured that your project is complex. And as long as you're demonstrating those aspects in your report, the reviewers will also see that it's complex. So it also comes down to the candidates understanding themselves of the complex requirements and their ability to represent it in the report and defend it in the interview as well. So it's a very good practice to actually get very fluent with those requirements.
Thank you.
Thanks, Red.
okay, there's a question in the Q&A from Tafadzwe regarding if you pursue a master's degree, and I think you did make reference to the project of a master's degree. I'm not sure if this is a coursework master's or a research master's. Can it be included as part of your IDP report? I'll let the panel answer rather than give all the answers myself.
Thanks, Tom. Yes. In fact, if you read the guidelines around the IDP, certain courses, if you haven't actually finished your postgrad studies, can be included in the IDP and mention of your masters as well. And you might also mention the masters in the TERs. And I think maybe let me hand over to John for further guidance.
I think that's exactly it. Your RPD is all related training that happens from your original qualification. So whether it be courses, further studies, up through to your masters and PhDs. But the only sort of caveat that I want to say, be careful that you don't use that as an outcome of your complexity. Rather use it for your RPD as opposed to, oh, this project is complex and I'm going to talk about it. Rather use a real engineering project for your discussion in your engineering report.
Yeah, I'll just chip in. So Friedrich and I like to talk about when you graduate, you are what we call unconsciously incompetent. You don't know what you don't know yet. IPD is all about acknowledging that you need to acquire new skills and new knowledge to enhance what you studied in your qualification and relevant to the environment in which you work. You may be in an area, and railway engineering we were discussing earlier is not very, very widely covered in undergraduate courses. And because you're in the rail sector, you've obviously gone and pursued other, be it postgrad or any other form of study in the rail sector. And I think, as John says, ECSA is interested to see that you understand the principle of lifelong learning, and you're going to have to do CPD once you are registered. So get into the spirit of doing it so that it's something that becomes part of your way of life. Which brings me to the next question for John and Shabnam. Jacoba says that if he started at a degree of responsibility like C, in other words, is there an expectation from ECSA's part that they must see the logical progression A, B, C, D to E, or can you in certain of the outcomes move directly into a higher level where you maybe are not observing, you start to do other things a lot quicker? Over to the panel.
Thanks, Tom. So just in terms of your degree of responsibility, as I said in my presentation, nowadays a lot of organizations do not start you off at level A. So ECSA do want to see a progression. They don't want to see you jumping in at level E just from your postgrad. You're now sitting at level E. Where did you start learning all the asking questions, getting advice from seniors, etc., etc. So starting at C, I wouldn't say is a particular issue with ECSA, from what I've seen in reports that have been submitted. So I don't see a particular issue with going from C to E, but I wouldn't say start at E, then ECSA is going to say question, how did you get that experience?
Tumi-san, do you want to add any comments now that you are uncensored? Or are they? Raylene, I think you've enabled Tumi-san, have you?
I think she's rejoining because there's a problem with her mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's jump into the next question, and this one is related more to process. So the question from Spiwe is the interview panel selected based on the contents of your engineering report? I'm assuming the question there, John and Shabnam, is ECSA mindful of the fact that, and we'll use civil engineering since most of us in the civil engineering space, is not just if you studied civil, you know everything, particularly in your competency. Does ECSA match the expectations of the candidate in terms of their area of exposure to those of the assessors in terms of their areas of competence, matching competencies? Good luck with answering that question.
Maybe John, I'll try. I think at bare minimum, yes, because it is a discipline-specific registration. So the reviewers that read the desktop or read the documentation and then in attendance at the interview have to be equipped and registered professionally in the same discipline. So for example, if we're using civil as the discipline, at the very minimum, they're professionally registered civil engineer. I understand with civil, for example, there are significant sub-disciplines. And that's the point where I have some uncertainty, and maybe we could query further with ECSA to give a certain answer. But maybe there, John, if you know, I'll hand to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So it is what they try and do is align the disciplines appropriately. Obviously, especially with the sub-disciplines that do come into play, it is what they try and do. I'm not saying they get it 100% right all the time, but you as an interviewee have the right to check who is in the interview panel and say, I'm not happy with this particular interview, doesn't have the relevant sub-discipline experience. You have that right to challenge them on that. Sometimes they do not get it right, and then that is obviously a concern for you as the candidate. So just make sure that you are aware of your rights at the interview, where you can actually challenge them on their competencies. That is the design, that the relevant discipline is associated with your application is in the interview panel.
I can just add that the problem, and the question is a very, very good question, because there are many, many anecdotal evidence cases of candidates who are, let's say, traffic engineers, who have a water engineer and a structural engineer asking them questions. The assessors generally tend to default to their own knowledge area, which puts the candidate at a distinct disadvantage. What ECSA have responded to date is their system, and you will notice, John and the others in particular who've been playing with this space for a long time, that they've only just recently added the subset subdiscipline as a question on the application form. They never used to have that, where you can now put civil engineering and then transportation or rail or whatever. They have said that at the moment, the methodology of allocating VPMs, virtual panel members, is not automated within the CRM. It's still being done manually. And the registration officers don't always know who they are allocating. So there is a rule that you can only interview at your level or lower. So if you are a PR tech eng or a PR eng and a technologist rocks up at your interview, then you have every right, as John says, to object to the fact that the person interviewing you is at a broadly defined competence level and not a complex competency level. But ECSA assures us, and when I say us, I'm referring in this case to SAICE, that the new CRM system, and we've answered some of the questions in the chat about the CRM system, which is your online portal process, will better match, so that when you are a traffic engineer, you will minimally have one traffic engineer. If you think it's bad for those in practice, you can imagine what's happening with the academics. The academics are sitting and they have 3 people from industry interviewing them, trying to find out when were you on site, when you did this, when you did that. And the more they explain, but I'm an academic, I teach in a university, I've never been to site as such, but I run pracs and I do this, and they are not succeeding because there's a mismatch. So we've also said to ECSA, if that's the way you're going to interview academics, you must make sure that all industry interviews have one academic on, so you can start talking to the candidate about hypotheses and, standard deviations and whatever it is to confuse the industry. No, I'm kidding. Don't want to do that. But I think the process could be a lot better. Perhaps that's what we should leave it at. But as John says, they do try. What we do know is that you should never have somebody that is from a different discipline interviewing you at the very least, but hopefully the subdisciplines are also better matched, or certainly will be going forward. We'll have to watch the space. Okay, there's a question on IDOAW, Prof. Dr. Sina, just so you understand it. The enforcement date was the 1st of April 2025. Enforcement is a relative term. What ECSA told all entities who have, and that would include universities, employ people that work in an engineering space as defined by the various codes of practice. Employers had to submit a status compliance report. It's a template that's available on ECSA's website. That template had to indicate all the professional employees and their categories, and then all the non-currently registered, and if candidates that they where they are, and with a plan of the course of action. Employers have basically been given 5 years to become compliant. If an employer at least has a process in place, whether you are, running through PDP's rota registration procedure or one of the many others that is available, you need to be able to just demonstrate that you have an intervention in place. The cop-out, and again, this is perhaps my personal opinion, is the only requirement from ECSA is that all people working in engineering-related jobs must be candidates with ECSA. Doesn't matter how long they've worked for or how soon they are close to registration, they are making the candidacy component a major compliance issue. Right now, ECSA is busy looking at the penalties that they can apply, and it could range from substantive fines or even to the degree of closing down a company. but they haven't published those or made those public knowledge at the moment. So don't sit and do nothing, because the elephant in the room will eventually stand on you. John and others, I don't know if you want to add any other comments to that particular IDOEW question.
No, thanks, Tom. Nothing from me.
Nothing from me.
Okay, then I see there's a question for John. For candidates with greater than 10 years experience, does it mean that they do not need to submit TERs for duration of the 10 years of their development?
Okay. No. So if you've got greater than 10 years, your earlier years of experience can be documented in a TEO. So it's basically a short summary of your experience for the different periods. There's not enough detail in there, and there is also the other reason for TEOs. Maybe it's a very old experience, many 10, 15 years ago, and that supervisor is not available. Your TEOs do not have to be signed by your supervisor. However, when you get to current experience, the last 3 to 4 years, and you can choose, it can be longer than 3 to 4 years, I would recommend that you write TERs, because that gives you a little bit more depth in terms of explaining a little bit more, as opposed to doing a bulleted point TEO. And obviously, because it's more recent, your supervisor should still be available to sign those particular reports. So a TEO is up to about the last 3 to 4 years, and you can depends on what you want to write about. Maybe there's a great project that you want to detail out that you did 6 years ago. I would then start your TERs from that particular period, because then you can detail out that relevant experience. Because to do that relevant experience in a TEO, I think you're going to lose a bit of explanation of competency for that aspect. So TEOs up to about 3 to 4 years, and then TERs till current. Yep.
Sorry, just to add there, that additional rule that at least if you're using TEOs in your submission, at least 3 years must be represented at level E using the TER template. So that's just an add-on rule there if you're using TEOs. So 3 years at level E at least on TERs.
Okay. Okay, so the next question is, I once heard that the BEng Tech Honors can give you an alternative to register for PrEng. However, now seems like it does no longer give you that route. Is there any clarification or advice on that?
I can answer that. So the BET Honors has never given you a alternative route to PrEng. That was some cheeky universities who thought they could sneak it in the endorsement process, but ECSA has very clearly clarified that in the R01 document, where the alternative route to PrEng, if you do not have a 4-year or 560 credit BEng degree, is the honors, the BET honors plus the professional masters. The professional masters is not what some universities, Stellenbosch, UCT, currently call a professional masters. It must be a degree that complies with the E22P policy, and it is a coursework master's degree which may or may not have a research component. But be careful that what you are actually getting is an endorsed qualification accredited by ECSA, and not just a qualification that they call professional, because it is post your base degree and it's related to extra specialized knowledge in a field. So BET honors plus MEng professional equates to the equivalent benchmark qualification as an alternative route to register as a candidate engineer.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Is there anyone that wants to add to that from the panelists?
One other thing I should just add is that the challenge is there's many thousands and thousands of people out there with the old BTech. That was your qualification that you did generally part-time 2 years after a national diploma. You will recall, certainly in civil, you could specialize in geotech, transport, urban, water, construction, structures, and environmental, if I remember the 7 fields. The route for those candidates is currently not clearly defined. In other words, you can't go from a BTech directly into the MEng professional, it would seem, even though the BTech, when it was offered, was done at an NQF level 8 level, which is equivalent to the current honours degree. The route, it would appear, is via conferment of status. That's the language that universities use, and it will be up to each university to define what it is that you need to do to either get to the MEng professional, or alternatively that they will make a prerequisite for the MEng professional, the honours. The scary part is there's many candidates out there currently doing their honours degree in anticipation of MEng professional, and they are all reporting that the content and or curriculum, although it should be complex engineering solving because it's at heading towards PrEng, is no different from what they did in their BTech degrees. But that's something ECSA is going to have to fix. They created the animal, they need to tame it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read Gloria's initial question, which is, my question is on complying with the 2,000 word limit for TEOs and TERs. I have over 10 years of experience across many ECSA defined periods. To stay within the limit, I've grouped multiple periods together, for example, consolidating all road and stormwater projects into one TER, resulting in 3 TERs and 2 TEOs. Will this approach be penalized? Is there a better way to manage the word count while still meeting ECSA requirements? John, maybe you can shine some light on this.
Yeah, so if we look at that, I saw a response from Tumi-san there in terms of the sequence. Ideally, it needs to be in the sequence of your work environment, so your responsibilities in that. So what I would suggest in terms of, if you have certain experience from one organization and you want to split it for, say, stormwater and water, I would create 2 separate periods. I wouldn't link it to a type of project. I would still keep it in the sequence of periods, as your summary needs to define those periods. So rather not look at projects, rather look at periods and pick a project from that period that you're going to write about. So that's why we say 67 periods is a good number, because you should be able to pick out 67 different aspects of all the outcomes within those 67 periods. So in terms of designing, in terms of managing, impacts, etc., where you are defining the various problems that you are solving. So that would be the way I would do it in terms of, I know the word limit count, but that's where ECSA are wanting to make sure that you are short and concise and are able to articulate. But as I say, rather write more TERs that you can articulate the different aspects of the different types of engineering, because they like to see a broad-based engineer. And the difficulty comes in terms of the total numbers of 2,000, but as I say, it's just a guide. So if you're going to write 2,500, 3,000 words, that would be accepted. But as long as you're not writing 10,000 words, then it becomes a bit excessive. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Tabiso is asking, are there any examples for a client civil engineer, say, working in municipal infrastructure? Is it advisable to rather consider consulting engineering experience instead to increase chances of passing?
Okay, so let me take this in terms of, we do a lot of mentoring for local government employees. Depending on your role within the municipality, we have had many municipal employees registered through various programs that we do run, but it just depends on your approach within that municipality, where we talk about designing or doing design checks. It sounds very simple, but as long as you're carrying out that whole process from the beginning all the way to the end and doing a parallel investigation and parallel design, you can facilitate the relevant complexity within the municipal environment, although it is a lot easier to achieve the complexity in the private sector. Yeah, hope that answers.
Hey, Christoph asks, if you are seconded to another workplace, can your progression in degree of responsibility continue seamlessly from your previous employer? Maybe continuing with degree of responsibility D at the new workplace, especially if you moved from doing planning work to more detailed design work. Not sure.
I don't see any challenges with that. Just depending on how the transition from the old to the new workplace goes. Sometimes, in some instances, your degree of responsibility will go back because obviously in your new environment. But it's not about the transition between the employees. It's more about the actual work that you're doing. Are you working at that responsibility, or are you working at a lower responsibility? So if your responsibility from one employer to the other employer is exactly the same, or you've now increased your responsibility by moving employer, you are basically wanting to articulate what you're currently doing. What is your current responsibility level?
Perfect. The next question is, if someone is on the interview panel and I know the person, can I object to having them on the panel due to conflict of interest? I do not believe that the person will conduct a fair interview. Tom, I'm not sure if you want to take this question or.
Yeah, look, I mean, you're allowed to, as John says, anytime during the process of the interview, if, for example, and we get these stories as well, there is a particularly, nasty, unkind, they make snide comments, and or pass sort of almost critical. They're meant to interview you based on what you've submitted. So you can say, look, I'm sorry, I would like to cancel this interview. But you need to understand that ECSA then kick in a new process. So what will happen is, firstly, you have to write immediately to ECSA, and it's to registration@exa.co.za, to explain that you were attending a whatever interview it was on such and such a date, that during the course of the interview, and you give an account for what happened that made you, which could be one of the panel members is known to you, you've previously had a disagreement with them because they stole your girlfriend or borrowed your car and crashed it, or whatever they did, and therefore there is a potential conflict of interest. I would have hoped that the actual assessor, and this is again where I have a problem with ECSA's processes, they should be the ones with all the experience that they have that should recuse themselves long before the candidate has to do it, but they don't always. What ECSA will do is, on receipt of that complaint, they will already have been informed by the registration officer that Bob cancelled the interview or terminated the interview. They will then go and they will get the recording of the interview, and they will appoint somebody. And I know Teresa Hutting, who's the manager registration, has been doing a lot of these herself. And they will review to see what happened. So I'll give you a good example. There was a youngster who was interviewed, arrived for a PR interview. First of all, they were 2.5 hours late, albeit ECSA kept informing. Now, you can imagine you're nervous. You already are worried about, am I ready, am I not ready? And you're not on tranquilizers or medication just yet, but if you have to wait 2.5 hours, you'd probably be an absolute gibbering idiot by the 2.5 hours. Anyway, the interview proceeded, and the candidate said, okay, am I going to now go ahead and do my presentation? As both the presenters this afternoon have so eloquently explained, that is you telling your story to back up what's been written in your report. The panel said, no, we're just going to ask you questions. And then the registration officer intervened and said, ladies and gentlemen, this is a PR interview. They came expecting it to be an EA interview when the EA, that's experience appraisal, used to be done. Now, that candidate immediately was granted a new interview with a new panel by ECSA, because in that circumstance, it wasn't the candidate's fault. It was mistakes by the panel. They won't automatically give you another interview. So the downside of abandoning an interview, and I'm not saying that the reasoning just given in the question isn't valid, is you've got to be very sure that you are putting yourself in a better position by abandoning it than allowing it to go through. And I can tell you the risk to ECSA, and we've also told ECSA this, is you do your presentation, you feel it went well, you handle the questions, and then you start getting some things. And there's the odd example recently where ECSA, a VPM will say, can you please recite the entire ECSA code of conduct to me? Now, if somebody asked me that question in an interview, I would say, well, if you can recite it to me, then I will tell you which parts of it you've left out, because nobody knows the entire code of conduct. Even in my case, I've had 50 years of experience. I still don't know the entire code. But be careful. You need to be sure that you are withdrawing or cancelling or terminating the interview where you have the moral high ground. If you do not have the moral high ground, the risk is ECSA will simply say the interviewers behaved professionally. There was nothing wrong with the line of questioning. You know, obviously where they have unconscious biases coming out, etc., then you can object. But there is a process that would follow. ECSA will only usually grant a candidate 2 interviews, where interview 1 was terminated or unsuccessful. It's unlikely they will grant somebody a 3rd interview if your second VPM panel also happens to have somebody that offended you for whatever reason. So be careful, but yes, it is within your rights.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so I do see it is 2 o'clock, but we just have a couple more questions, and then I think we can close off the meeting. So Vuba is asking, according to ECSA, if an applicant has trained under a CNU, the registered mentor for that CNU must provide one of the referee reports. Does this mentor need to be registered as a mentor with ECSA, or is it sufficient for them to be ECSA PR registered for the CNU in question? John, I think you can answer that because you mentioned the referee reports.
Yeah, so they don't have to be registered as a mentor, because when they are on the CNU, they are signing the CNU as a mentor on that CNU. So it's all part of the CNU process in terms of getting it signed. All mentors that are associated with that CNU are signing for in agreement that they will conduct their training, etc., accordingly. So they don't have to, they just have to be registered. They don't have to be registered as a mentor with ECSA, as long as they have signed that CNU that they are partaking in the training. That's all they need to be, and obviously registered. That's a requirement as a referee. They have to be registered in a category of the same or above.
Okay. Then we have another one saying, has ECSA changed their current operating model, like window-based submissions?
I think it's been alluded to that ECSA have now opted to go with a continuous submission. However, that is only starting on the 15th of August. They are still trying to deal with backlogs, etc. So the window-based options are now not going to be in place, which was going to be 15th of July to the end of August. They've now shifted it to opening on the 15th of August and being continuous thereafter. But in saying that, the windows were great. They had time bars, pushed everybody for submission. With this continuous one, every candidate now needs to run their program tightly so that they make sure that they meet their own personal deadline, because X is not going to have a deadline for you.
Okay, thank you. Then the next question is it a problem if your projects are mainly overseas instead of South Africa? But do you demonstrate the outcomes? Shubnam, I'm not sure if you want to answer that.
Yeah, definitely I can. So I've actually recently assisted a foreign candidate who actually worked at a foreign organization. And it is, if you read through the policies, and we had to read through the policies quite carefully, and then we raised a query with ECSA, and they confirmed that foreign experience is acceptable. And obviously then the follow on to that question was, as long as it meets the standard, and again, the standard being right complexity level, the correct outcomes and all the outcomes, and at the right degree of responsibility. So as long as the work conforms to the standard, whether it's local or international, it can be used for your application.
Thank you. Then Ntobeli is asking, can I use a project under TO, not a TER, for my ER report?
Yeah, that's tricky. It really depends on what degree of responsibility that TEO is reflecting. And also just coming back to the guidance John had given earlier is that you do want to have some detail of the project that eventually leads to the ER contained in the TE type reports. So let's just get back to the DOR. If you read the rules in the application form, ECSA suggests or provides guidance that the project you present in your engineering report should be at least from a DOR-D period or DOR-E period. Me personally, I always prefer targeting projects in DOR-E because a lot of the outcomes have to be achieved at DOR-E anyway. So if the TO that you're referring to is A, B, or C, then it can't be used. And then if it is a valid D or E TO, you'd rather probably write that as a TER anyway to get the detail that correctly aligns with the project that you're going to present to the ER. And then maybe I'll just hand back to John just to confirm if that guidance is suitable.
Absolutely perfect. I was just going to say exactly the same. You know, you're going to lose a lot of detail in a TEO, whereas a TER, you can expand on what you did, and that just gives it a bit more context in terms of your engineering report. Again, making sure it aligns to the relevant complexity and degree of responsibility. So I think it was well covered there. Thank you.
Okay, then Mojalefa is, I think, just confirming. So to register PrEng with an MEng, experience considered is it only experience acquired after the masters?
Is that the question relating to the professional masters?
Correct.
Yes, correct.
So ECSA's requirement is it's always a minimum of 3 years after a benchmark qualification. So if you've got 40 years of experience and you only just finished your qualification last year because you took the scenic route, then your 3 years start when you finished it. But then you might as well go the alternative route. Not easy, but sometimes a lot quicker. You can get PR Tech Eng as an example. The PrEng, which is today's discussion, there's not really an alternative route according to E17P. Many have tried it. I think they've got lost along the way. But on the technologist and technician, there is alternative routes. I think it's 20 years for technologist post-matric, but you've got to defend in the E18 BDR form. You've got to defend your knowledge acquisition as you've gone through your work experience. So the answer to the question is you need 3 years post the masters, like anyone else.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we have one last question in the chat, and then there's one in the Q&A. So Tim is asking, is there someone who can check a report or application prior to submission to ECSA and offer an opinion if the report has been completed?
Yeah, really, I think that's why I particularly referenced engaging your referees. Hopefully, some of them are directly as your mentor early in your process. They will definitely be very helpful to review. And I think maybe John might have some advice as well.
Yeah, without doing a sales pitch, that's what our organization does in terms of SAICE PDP. But it does come at a fee because that's our business. So you can approach us and we will go review the application and make comments on that.
Perfect. Okay, then Katleho has asked, would it be acceptable to use projects from different disciplines? For example, one focused on substations and another on transmission to demonstrate the required outcomes, or should all examples be drawn from a single discipline? Nama, I think maybe you can answer this.
Yeah, that's electrical.
Electrical, yeah.
So remember as well, electricals, I think somewhat more easy to do than civil in that electrical is the basket discipline. So transmission lines, substations falling under electrical, easy enough. Great, we're in the same discipline. Now, if you're talking about using those two projects in your engineering report, remember you have to get through 10 engineering work-based outcomes plus 11 being the training, but there has to be some logic to how you use your work in the engineering report. For example, outcomes 1 and 2, and then also consequently 3, relate to problem solving and the application of knowledge. You can't take maybe the substation problem and use it for outcome 1 and then create the solution using the transmission project for outcome 2. There's no logic to that. So ideally, the way you want to structure your report, and the advice I often give is pick your best project, the most consistently compliant project across all outcomes, and see what you get out of it in terms of complete compliance to the outcomes. And if you then have gaps, consider how to introduce an additional project without creating confusion. Because remember, these are the reviewers need to understand what you're presenting. You don't want to confuse them. You want to show them in the way you write compliance. And if you suddenly throw in a variety of projects, you're going to confuse them and it's going to be at a high level. So yes, you can use in the engineering report in that example, a substation and then a transmission line project, for example, but how you use it is actually the question, and you have to effectively use them to have a logic and then prove all of the outcomes. And then maybe John, on the civil side, is there similar advice for the civil engineers?
Yeah, so from the civil side, in terms of the different types of projects, I would look at in your TER detailing out the various subdisciplines that you may have been in contact with or designed for, so water, sewer, roads, if you have done those. And then in your engineering report, select the project that you, as the individual, are most comfortable in talking the details of. So I've done a sewer design, I've done a water design. But if the guy asks me a real tough question on sewer, I might not be that confident in answering it. But with water, I 100% know all the aspects, all the variables, all the aspects of water design. I'd rather write the water project in my engineering report, but still cover the sewer project in my TER. It just shows different experience that you have gained throughout your career, and then you focus on the detail of the one that you are most confident in talking to at the PR interview. Because remember, at the PR interview, you want to be able to have this discussion comfortably with those reviewers. And if you don't, that's when you're going to get the questions asked. You want to rather have the ball in their court where they're asking little questions, not the big questions on a particular aspect of your project.
Awesome.
you.
Thank you. And then I am going to close the session. Thank you so much to everyone who has attended. We hope you leave the session informed, inspired, and empowered in your journey as a professional engineer. Well, your journey to achieving your professional registration. And all the best to those who are in the process of getting ready to submit. And thank you to our presenters for being here today and for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. I think our time together has been extremely beneficial. So on that note, I am going to end the session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Raylene.
Thanks and cheers,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.